Hey guys, welcome to the Way Educational Consult. So today we are going to be talking about friction. Now, what's friction? It's a very common language we use. Friction, friction, friction. What's friction? Friction occurs when is a type of force that occur when you have two surfaces in contact, and it prevents those two surfaces from sliding over each other. So that's friction. So, and one peculiar thing about friction is that friction tends to oppose motion. It opposes motion, and friction force cannot occur until there is a relative motion. That's there is motion between the two surfaces in contact. And frictional force, let's say I have the first surface here and I have another surface on this surface, and let's say for instance I pull this like this. Frictional force will always tend to oppose the motion, so it will go in the other direction. Frictional force will always act in the other direction. So that's one peculiar thing about motion. So let's talk about the type of frictions that we have. We have two major type of friction. We have the static friction. And we have the kinetic or dynamic friction. What's the static friction? Static friction is the maximum amount of force that must be overcome before a body can start to move. What's the meaning of that? Let's say for instance, the frictional force acting on this board, let's say for instance is 7 Newton. So it means that before I can be able to push this board, I must apply a maximum force of what? 7 Newton before to overcome that friction. At least I must apply 7 Newton before this board can move. Do you understand what I'm saying? So it is the maximum amount of force. Static friction is the maximum amount of force that must be overcome before a body can just start to move. So it means that if I should continue to push this board, 5 Newton, this board won't move. 6 Newton, it will move. Until I get to 7 Newton, then it will just want to start moving. So that's static friction. So that kind of friction is static. From the word static. Static means something is at rest. Now, the second one, we have dynamic friction. What's the meaning of dynamic? From the word kinetic or dynamic, it means in motion. This is the type of force. It's the type of frictional force that is possessed by a body that is moving. It's the amount of force that must be overcome so that a body can move with a uniform or constant velocity. So that's kinetic or dynamic friction. Do you understand what I'm saying? So that's kinetic or dynamic friction. Now let's quickly look at the laws of solid friction. There are laws of solid friction, and these were gotten from experiment. Now the first law of solid friction is that frictional force opposes relative motion between two surfaces in contact. I already explained that. When you have a force pulling a body to this side, frictional force will always want it to wait, so it will always act in the opposite direction. So that's the first law. It opposes relative motion between two surfaces in contact. The second one, frictional force increase to the same extent as the force that tends to start the motion. The frictional force increase to the same extent as the force that tends to start with the motion. Let's say for instance, let's say I want to push this board. I want to explain the second law now. Let's say I want to push this board. The frictional force acting on this board, let's say it's 7 Newton. Do you know that the board is stationary, so it will appear like there is no force acting on it. So let's say I now apply a force of 2 Newton. The frictional force on this board will also increase to 2 Newton, but it won't move until I get to that 7 Newton. If I should increase my force to 5 Newton, frictional force will also increase to 5 Newton. If I should increase my force to 7 Newton, then the frictional force will now reach its maximum. That's 7 Newton. So the moment I now apply a force greater than 7 Newton, then it will now start to move. So that's what the second law of solid friction is trying to tell us, that frictional force increases to the same extent as the force that tends to start the motion. So as the force you apply increases, the frictional force will also increase until it gets to the maximum frictional force. Then the body will now start to It will now start to move. Now the third one, it says that frictional force depends on the nature of two surfaces in contact. Yes, whether the surface is rough or smooth. Now, when you have two very smooth surfaces, the frictional force is going to be less there than when you have two rough surfaces. When you have two rough surfaces in contact, the frictional force is going to be very, very high. But when you have a smooth surface, the frictional force is going to be very low. So it means that the rougher the two surfaces in contact, the higher the frictional force, and the smoother the surfaces in contact, the lesser the frictional force. Okay, the fourth one now. Frictional force is independent of the area of surface, is independent of the area of surface in contact. Yes, frictional force does not depend on the area. Either it is small surface area or a large surface area. It doesn't depend. Frictional force doesn't depend on that. Frictional force depends on, but frictional force will depend on what? The surface of contact, either smooth or rough. Now, the last one, they said frictional force varies directly with the normal force, that it is proportional to the normal reaction. It means that frictional force, let's represent it as F, is directly proportional to what? Normal reaction. Like I said earlier, the normal reaction is the upward reaction. Let's say, for instance, you have the weight of this object, the weight acting downward, weight mg. The normal reaction is the what? Equal, from Newton's third law of motion. It says that what? To every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. So it means that for a weight acting downward, there will be an opposite reaction acting upward. So that's your normal reaction. So it says that frictional force is what? Directly proportional to this what? Normal reaction. And if we should introduce constant of proportionality, I can say that F equals to mu R. Where this mu is my what? Coefficient. It will be coefficient of static friction. That's if the body is stationary. And it could also be coefficient of what? Dynamic or kinetic friction. That's when the body is moving. Do you understand what I'm saying? So this mu here is a constant. So this is what leads us to the what? Formula for what? Frictional force. Where F is your frictional force, mu is your constant of coefficient of static or dynamic friction, and this your R is your what? Normal reaction, which in this case, your normal reaction is also going to be equals to what? Mg in this case on the horizontal. All right, having discussed the laws of solid friction, let's quickly talk about the advantages of friction. Yes, advantages and disadvantages of friction. Let's start with the advantages first. Now, one advantage of friction is that without friction, anytime we are walking, we won't be able to stop walking. You just keep walking infinitely, infinitely if there is no friction. But because of friction, you can stop and you come to an halt because of friction. Now, also, one advantage of friction is that friction enables the automobiles of cars and machines to make a grip firm grip with the floor. That's why tires tires of automobiles, they always have treads. Treads are those lines, those thick lines on the surface of those tires. So it's to increase the frictional force between the road and the tires. So that's one advantage of friction. Also, another advantage of friction is that friction enables us to sharpen our knives. You know, when you make use of grinding stone to grind, it uses friction. Do you understand what I'm saying? So that's one advantage of friction. So another advantage of friction is that friction enables nails to stay in position when you drill them into an hole, maybe into a wood or into a wall. It is the force of friction that enables them to what? To stay in place without falling or removing from their position. Also, another advantage of friction is that friction enables car brakes to function. When you apply your brake, it's because of friction. It works on the principle of friction. So these are the advantages of friction. So let's talk about the disadvantage of friction. The disadvantage of friction is that friction causes wear and tear. Do you know that when you have two bodies rubbing together, it will cause wear and tear, and it will reduce the efficiency of, let's say, maybe a machine or anything in contact. So it will reduce the efficiency. So another disadvantage of friction is that friction, a lot of work or energy is wasted in overcoming friction. Do you understand what I'm saying? So the work that I'm supposed to be putting in to be yielding more productivity, I'll be wasting part of it to overcome force of friction. So that's why friction is also what? Is also a disadvantage, because I'm wasting some work, some of this energy to what? Overcome friction. Do you understand what I'm saying? So another disadvantage of friction is that friction produces heat. So it means it's also a way to say that what? Energy is being lost. Friction makes you lose energy. Look at this, for instance, when you rub your two hands together, you see that it produces heat and sound also. So it means that frictional force can be produced. Frictional force can mix energy to reduce in form of what? Heat or what? Or sound. So these are the disadvantages of what? Of friction. So like a major saying that friction is a blessing and it's also a curse. It's a blessing and it's also a curse. All right. So let's talk about ways of reducing friction, because too much of friction is not good and much less of friction is also not good. So how can we reduce friction? Friction can be reduced by one, By using lubricants. Lubricants. By use of lubricants. By use of lubricants. When you say lubricants, that's when you use graphite, use your graphite, grease, engine oil and co to reduce friction. That's when you apply the grease in ball bearing that is used in grinding or a machine that rotates. So in order for it to rotate smoothly, you have to grease it so that it can be what? It can reduce the friction of the engine. So another way of reducing friction is by using by streamlining. By streamlining. What's the meaning of streamlining? Streamlining means that you make the shape of an object in a fluid shape in such a way that it reduces friction. Aeroplane or cars are very good examples. Let's say for instance that the shape of aeroplane is like this. Let's say for instance the shape of aeroplane is like this, and you have when the aeroplane is moving, you have air moving in this direction. It will cause friction, then it will reduce the forward movement of the airplane. But when the airplane is streamlined, it looks something like this. If I can draw that well. When the airplane is streamlined, it looks something like this. It looks something like this. So now, by streamlining it like this, the air will be able to flow up and down easily without stress. So it will reduce friction. So this is what they call streamlining. So when you turn the shape, same thing with cars. Cars are streamlined for easy passage of what? Of air to reduce friction. So another way of reducing friction is by banking the roads. When you say banking of roads it's very common in roundabouts. Let's say for instance you don't want to skid away. What's the meaning of that? Let's say for instance I'm coming with a very very high speed and I want to take a turn. Let's say I now take a turn and my speed is too high. Of course I could take a turn and I'm going to drift away. So when you bank the road is banked in such a way that when you have a roundabout, then the circular part of the road is in such a way that it is elevated. So when you want to skid, the circular part of the road that is elevated is going to return you back. You won't be able to drift away. So that's banking. You can check it up. So that's banking. So these are ways of reducing friction. So in the next class, we are going to be talking of calculation. We are going to be talking about the calculations of friction and the different cases you can have friction.